Alright, here we are inside the Civic today. I've been having some issues with it running really bad. I think I've narrowed it down to pairs of injectors dropping out intermittently, and that started after I dropped the ECU on the concrete floor. So my suspicion is there's a loose wire or broken solder joint or something inside the ECU, but see if I can start it and make it run like it has been. Oh, it's gonna run great now apparently. That's annoying. Alright, mechanic is not able to replicate the sound of the customer's complaint. Let's try this some more here. Well, that's annoying. It doesn't seem to be doing it at all now. But I do know there's a problem, so I think I'm gonna take the ECU apart and try to wiggle stuff around and see what I get. Alrighty, so this is looking into the back of the ECU. You can see there's 3 yellow lights in there flashing towards the middle of the ECU, like right in this area here. And those are the ignition coil signals. And the 3 red LEDs are the injector driver signals. So it looks like the injectors are dropping out, but it's just the sample rate on this camera. They're not actually dropping out right now. However, if I poke things and move stuff around in here, does it start doing that? So these are the MOSFET drivers that drive those circuits. It seems to be running fine. Well, when I was driving it the other day, I could actually see the 2 far red LEDs dropping out when it was running poorly. So I was losing fuel injectors on 2 or 4 cylinders at a time because they're fired in pairs. So I need to maybe drive this thing a little bit and try to get it to do the same thing. I don't know. Moving these doesn't really seem to make any difference. To be continued. Alright, so here we are taking this thing for a test drive. To see if it's going to miss. Seems to be running okay right now. So far I haven't noticed any misses at all. kind of got it doing it. There, you can hear it. It does it when it's like upright like this, which is how I put it when I have the interior installed. It's upright like this, or like this. Alright, I do have the data log running, so let's check that out. Well, this tells kind of a sad story. It looks like I'm getting sync losses, actually. Just sitting here idling, I'm getting a bunch of sync losses. And then the AFR goes super lean and it starts to die. And I'm not shaking the ECU around now. So I wonder if it's like heat soak of the crank position sensor or something else. Let's see, what happens down here when it does that? It's gonna die eventually here. Let's see if I can get this thing in the garage before it stops running altogether. So I did run a data log to see hopefully what's going on here before I start tearing into this thing. So the green line down here is the sync loss counter. As you can see, that's slowly going up. And the white line up here is RPM. You can see it's around 850 or so here, and then it drops off to 0. And then it'll drop to 0 again, and then I'm using timing control for idle speed control. And you can see it overshoots a little bit and then comes back to around 850 and then sort of drops out randomly again. It always seems to drop out kind of in these pairs. I'm not sure why that is. First thought was maybe I've got a bad connection to the ECU power, but I don't think that's it because, let's see, battery voltage is the red line. You can just see it peeking out there a little bit. It didn't change really at all. And the ECU gets the battery voltage reading off of the power coming into it. So air-fuel ratio is there. As you can see, it goes super rich after it misses when it's, or I mean super lean when it misses, when it comes back. So I think there's actually maybe two things going on. One is possibly an issue with the injectors. I guess it's also possible that I'm losing sync due to a crank position sensor issue, and that's causing the rough running and the injectors to drop out, and I'm just trying to diagnose looking at those LEDs, and I'm not doing a very good job at that. In any case, that's kind of a secondary issue. I know I'm getting sync losses that are causing the engine to almost die, and that's what I need to address. So I think what I'm going to do is, let's see here. Let me show you here. On the J series, here we go. On the J series, the crank position sensor actually has two separate sensors in it. It's got a crank position A which is the one I'm using, and crank position B, which is the backup one. Now I'm not sure why they have two separate ones in here, but you can see each one gets power and ground separately, and then each one has a signal coming back to the original ECU. So there's a 6-pin connector at the back of the engine that I can swap the blue and the blue-red pins to start using the crank position sensor B, and that saves me the trouble of taking the front of the engine apart to get to the crank position sensor, because I know at least you got to take the damper off, the crank pulley off, which is not that much fun on these, and possibly the timing belt and all that stuff. So I'm going to see if maybe just this sensor is flaky and try to use this one. I'll have to, because they kind of sit in there next to each other. The ignition offset will be different, but I can check that with my timing lights. So I think that's what I'm going to try to do and see if that fixes it. I probably should just put a crank position sensor in it, but I want to try this first because I think this could help me at least narrow it down or determine that that's not the issue. I'm not sure. We'll see what happens. Alrighty, so here's the harness that goes to the back of the engine. There's a VTEC solenoid, oil pressure switch, VTEC pressure switch, and then this is the connector for the crank position sensor. As you can see here, there's, maybe you can see, yeah, now you can see, there's two yellow with black wires, and those are power wires. There's two brown with yellow wires, those are the ground wires, and then there's a blue wire right here, which is the one I'm using, crank position A, and then there's the blue with red right here, which is crank position B. So I'm going to swap the blue and red wires and change my ignition offset and see how that goes. Alright, so now instead of the blue wire being over here, there's your blue and red, and then the blue wire was moved over to here. So that should allow me to swap which crank position sensor I'm using and give this a try. Alright, well, I've been ripping my hair out trying to figure out what's going on with this Speeduino and why it's been dropping RPM pretty frequently. Tested continuity from the plug to the board, from the board where the wires are connected to every point in the circuit for the crank position sensor. My theory was that it was dropping out. Replaced the crank position sensor. So anyways, I believe I found the problem, maybe. This IC4, this is the Speeduino schematic. IC4 provides protection for the crank position sensor signal. So it's connected here, ADC clamp. And I've got, I think, a bad solder joint. So there's my IC4 chip here. And let's see if we can show you this. There we go. This solder joint here is the ground for that chip, and it is just barely was making contact, and I think when I dropped it, I broke the joint, or bent the pin a little bit more than it was before, and it was losing connection. So I'm going to try to solder that up and see if it works. All right, well, my experience has been that all car projects have a time where you just need to take a walk in nature. And I'm kind of there with this Civic. So you've watched several minutes of me trying to figure out where my cam signal was going. I've done a handful of things, which I showed some of in the video. One was replace the cam position sensor. I took 12 teeth off of the crank trigger wheel, so now it's a 12 minus 1 instead of a 24 minus 1 like it was. I saw a little bit of funky stuff on the scope with the tooth that I welded on there. It was working well enough, and I don't think that was the problem, but I was kind of desperate. I tried using crank sensor B on both my old and new sensors. I checked the connector plugs for the wiring harness that go to the crank position sensor. I'm to the point where I don't think that it's an issue with the harness or the sensor. I think it's an issue with the actual ECU that I built itself. And I do not believe that it's an issue with the Arduino board itself. So that sort of leads me to believe that it's the actual board itself that I soldered the components onto, the Speeduino 0.4 board. So I could spend a lot of time replacing wires, checking traces. Everything beeped out okay with the multimeter, so it seems to have continuity, but something about when it's running, something must warm up, or I don't know what's going on. I didn't want to go through and remelt all the connections. I did have an idea that I could just use the crank or the cam position input instead of the crank position input and change the firmware, but that's probably a band-aid solution. So the next video and that broken solder joint that I showed you was not the problem. That didn't help at all when I fixed that. So soon I'll post another video about how I'm going to fix that. I'm going to abandon my homemade, home soldered 0.4 Speeduino board for a detonation EMS X4. So I'm currently waiting on that to come in the mail. So that'll be the next episode. This is the episode where I'm frustrated and want to roll it off the cliff. So I won't do that. It might be a little bit before the next video because I've got some other hobbies that I like to pursue, and the summer's ending soon, so I'm gonna run a 5K race. I rode my bike 100 miles a couple weeks ago just for fun, and just hanging out. It's Labor Day weekend, so peace. See you next time.